Hi everyone, the book I'm reviewing today is called The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh. This book was recommended by Zayda Adams. Thank you, Zayda. This was such a life-changing read. I'm really grateful for the recommendation. And I would say that this is one of the books that you have to read in your lifetime. There is so much of insight and history and so much to think through. And as I was reading this book, we're taught history repeats itself. And with the way the world is right now, you can actually see so many of these things. Amitav is really gifted in the way he story tells, and absolutely don't miss this book. If there's one book that you read in your life, it's definitely this one. I even struggled to put it down. I mean, I went through it within 2 days because it really is so deeply, I'm even at a loss of words, deeply intriguing, and you just want to continue reading. And it really is a parable for a planet in crisis, as ours is right now. And as I read through it, there are so many things that we are really not taught in school and in our history classes, and you hear through the elders in the community, and being young and you don't pay too much of attention, or you hear but you don't understand. This tied up so many of those narratives and stories. An absolutely must read. What a beautiful book. Thank you, Zayda. I'll read some extracts. This is from a chapter called Burn Everywhere Their Dwellings. If the victors assumed that they had the right to formally extinguish a tribe, it was because European doctrines of empire had indeed evolved in that direction. These doctrines found their fullest articulation in the work of the philosopher, polemicist, and Lord Chancellor of England, Sir Francis Browne, in his An Advertisement Touching a Holy War, which was written around the time of the Banda massacre and published shortly before the Pequot War. Bacon lays out in some detail the reasons why it was lawful, in his view, for Christian Europeans to end the existence of certain groups. For like as there are particular persons outlawed and prescribed by civil laws of several countries, so are there nations that are outlawed and prescribed by the law of nature and nations, or by the immediate commandment of God. These wayward countries, Bacon argues, are not nations at all, but rather routs and shoals of people, as have utterly degenerated from the laws of nature. Such being the case, it was both lawful and godly for any nation that is civil and policed to cut them off from the face of the earth. This doctrine was formalized by Emma de Vattel, one of the jurists who codified international law in the late 18th century. Nations are justified, he ruled, in uniting together as a body with the object of punishing and even exterminating such savage peoples. This argument effectively conferred on Christian Europeans a God-given right to attack and extinguish peoples who appeared errant or monstrous in their eyes. It is in this crucial thought, argues Peter Leinberg and Marcus Rediker, that genocide and divinity cross. Bacon's advertisement for a holy war was thus a call for several types of genocide, which found its sanction in biblical and classical antiquity. Bacon's reasonings may appear archaic, but it continues to animate the workings of the empire to this day. In essence, he was making the argument that a well-governed country, any nation that is civil and policed, has an absolute right to invade countries that are degenerate or in violation of the laws of nature and nations. This is, of course, the fundamental doctrine of liberal interventionism, and it has been evoked many times in recent decades to justify wars of choice launched by Western powers. And these wars of choice that we have in these recent decades witnessed and witnessing. This is from a chapter called "The Fruits of the Nutmeg Have Died." To envisage the world in this way was a crucial step towards making an inert nature a reality. As Ben Ehrenreich observes, only once we imagined the world as dead could we dedicate ourselves to making it so. This is from a chapter called Terraforming. I had to sit with this for a while. I mean, this concept of terraforming and the way Amitav unpacks and educates you on it has completely changed my perspective on so many things. Renaming was one of the principal instruments in which colonists erased the prior meanings of conquered landscapes. In New England, soon after the Puritans had exterminated the picket, they applied themselves to the task of cutting off, in John Mason's words, the remembrance of them from the earth by erasing the tribe's name. To that end, the General Assembly of Connecticut decided that the survivors would not be allowed to call themselves Pickets, that the Picket River would become the Thames, and that the village known as Picket would be renamed New London. In remembrance, the legislators declared, of the chief city in our dear native country. In such acts of renaming, the adjective new comes to be invested with an extraordinary semantic and symbolic violence. Not only does it create tabula rasa, erasing the past, but it also invests a place with meaning derived from faraway places, our dear native country. This concept of terraforming can be applied to various different scenarios and situations about naming. From the same chapter, yet what was once considered a certainty by Western scientists and administrators, educators and intellectuals has not come to pass. Neither the picket, nor the Dene, nor the Bandanese have disappeared. Having lived through the ending of their worlds, they have found ways not merely to survive, but even in some instances to flourish. Also from the same chapter, in the history of colonization of North America by the English, again occupies a special place. It was there that processes of terraforming were applied most intensively and with the greatest success, in the sense that large tracts of land were re-engineered to resemble European models so that they would suit European ways of life. To remake immense stretches of terrain to suit the lifestyles of another continent inevitably entailed the undermining and elimination of the ways of life of those who had inhabited those lands for many thousands of years. The project of terraforming was therefore fundamentally conflictual. It was in itself a mode of warfare of a distinctive kind. In a prize-winning essay titled Biological Warfare in the 18th Century North America, the historian Elizabeth Fenn notes that the exchange between Amherst and Bouquet was not anomalous. Evidence from other fields of battle indicate that in the minds of many, smallpox had established, if irregular, place in the late 18th century warfare. She notes also that for a weapon of war, smallpox had another advantage. Unlike rape, pillage, and other atrocities in which the intent and identity of the perpetrator could be made clear, the propagation of smallpox had the advantage of deniability. Native Americans weren't the only people against whom the British deployed disease. They used this form of warfare also against white Americans during the Revolutionary War. This is from a chapter called Father of All Things. Indeed, the predicament of the U.S. Department of Defense is a refraction of the quandary that now confronts the world's status quo powers. How do you reduce dependence on the very resources on which your geopolitical power is founded? How do you reduce the fossil fuel consumption of a gargantuan military machine that exists largely to serve as a delivery service for hydrocarbons? Nor can these establishments be expected to address the unseen drivers of the planetary crisis, such as inequities of class, race, and geopolitical power. Their very mission is to preserve the hierarchies that favor the status quo. No one has ever stated this more clearly than George Kennan, one of the architects of the post-war strategic order. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, he told the US leaders in the US in 1948, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relations which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. It may seem natural today that military and paramilitary personnel should lead the response to disasters, but there is no intrinsic reason why this should be so. Civil society organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, and many others have all the necessary skills to act as first responders. If they lack aircraft and ships, it is only because no international mechanism exists for making such resources available to them. It is because of political choice, then, that disasters are being militarized, a choice that derives ultimately from a wider process whereby many societies have become saturated with militarism. To look these facts in the face is to recognize that it is a grave error to imagine that the world is not preparing for the disrupted planet of the future. It's just that it's not preparing by taking mitigatory measures or by reducing emissions. Instead, it is preparing for a new geopolitical struggle for dominance. This is from a chapter called Vulnerabilities. For the purposes of military planning, pandemics and climate change are both often treated as threat multipliers. The usual conclusion is that disasters and outbreaks of new diseases will not only take a terrible toll of lives in poor countries, but will also lead to riots and uprisings that could culminate in the collapse of state structures. Thinking along these lines, many prominent Western voices predicted a COVID apocalypse for Africa, even as their own hospitals were filling up and dead bodies were being buried in mass graves. But Africa's COVID apocalypse never materialized, and a few sub-Saharan countries like Senegal had some of the best outcomes in the world. These outcomes suggest that contrary to received wisdom, the conditions that Western elites have long stigmatized as backward and underdeveloped may in fact create certain kinds of resilience. It was probably because African leaders had prior experience of infectious diseases and were therefore well aware of the fragility of their healthcare systems that they took prompt and decisive action, while their Western counterparts complacently assumed that the pandemic would pass them by. At least one major American philanthropist is known to have predicted that bodies would be strewn across the streets of African countries, even as the situation was worsening in the US. Commenting on this, the journalists Caleb Okereke and Kelsey Nielsen write, "Indeed, the white gaze knows no rest, even amid a pandemic that has struck the West." In March 2020, war-torn Somalia, one of the world's most beleaguered countries, sent 20 doctors to help Italy with its outbreak of COVID-19. Nor did the pandemic lead to political upheavals and societal breakdowns in poor countries, contrary to the confident predictions of Western thought leaders. This is from a chapter called "A Fog of Numbers." As with the nutmeg, the clove was very picky in choosing where to grow. Everything had to be just so in order for it to flourish. On the slopes of Ternate's mountain Gamalama, clove trees found a home that perfectly suited them, just as nutmegs had found their ideal home in low-lying islands of the Bandas. It is said that nutmeg trees must be able to smell the sea, whereas clove trees must be able to see it. Only on these clusters of islands did a number of different factors fall into alignment in such a way to create perfect homes for these gifts of the earth. But what the earth gives, it can also take away. This is an extract from a chapter called "War by Another Name." Yet the parallels with the biopolitical wars over the past are perfectly clear to many indigenous people. Thus, the title of Nick Estier's powerful account of the environmental struggles of the Lakota and their kin, "Our History is the Future." From this perspective, as many indigenous voices have reiterated again and again, the present phase of the planetary crisis is not new at all. Rather, it represents the Earth's response to the globalization of the ecological transformations that were set in motion by the European colonization of much of the world. Those processes have now escaped the boundaries of the 3 colonized continents and have become planetary forces, in no small part because Western settler colonial culture is no longer confined to the settler colonies. Since the adoption in 1989 of the Washington Consensus, the ideologies and practices of settler colonialism have been actively promoted in their neoliberal guise by the world's most powerful countries and have come to be almost universally adopted by national and global elites. It is those settler colonial practices that are now being implemented by China in Xinjiang, by Indonesia in Papua, and by India in Kashmir and in many of its forest regions. It is impossible to make sense of much that is happening today without acknowledging this. Why is it, for example, that it often happened in recent years that even as terraformed neo-Europes of Australia and the Americas were being devastated by climate disasters, many of those countries' leaders doubled down on expanding the search for fossil fuels? Why is it that every substantial sanction of the populations of countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and Brazil supported and continue to support such policies? Why is it that the slogan "Drill, baby, drill" gained as much traction as it did in the United States, a country which, along with other Anglophone nations, produces much of the scientific literature on anthropogenic climate change? Is it that the people who support these policies are stupid and cannot understand the rising risks? Or is it because they see those risks differently because of historical memories that are so specific to settler colonialism? Is it perhaps because the tactic of conflict through inaction is not new to the places where they live? Or could it be that historical experience has taught them that terraforming is an inherently violent and risky process, but that in the end the odds will be on their side because of what they imagine to be their biological and technical advantages? And it is surely no accident that today too there exists a technology of last resort that many believe will ultimately work in favor of the Neo-Europes: geoengineering. Novel as it may seem, geoengineering is nothing other than terraforming carried literally into the stratosphere. It should by rights be called stratoforming. Today, some of the most richest and powerful and people and institutions in the West are openly promoting geoengineering. Their enthusiasm makes it impossible to forget that from the mid-18th century onward, modern science explicitly supported empire-defining strategies for colonization. If you've read this book, definitely let me know. And if not, go and grab it and read it for the holidays. You won't regret it. The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh. And thank you, Zaira, again for an absolutely phenomenal recommendation.